Because the line of control goes back, like so many other things, to our independence or achievement of independence. When, as far as Jammu and Kashmir was concerned, whereas the princely states were to exercise the option of opting for India or Pakistan, Maharaja Hari Singh procrastinated, and in the third week of October, hordes of Pakistani invaders came, the tribesmen, assisted by the Pakistan military, came across, took the state forces by surprise. They were, in some cases, inadequate and unprepared, and enabled the invaders to almost reach the outskirts of the capital, Srinagar, when, fortunately, I think they were apparently delayed by the desire to rape and loot in Baramulla. And during that time, Maharaja Hari Singh signed the instrument of accession, and the Indian armed forces were hurriedly airlifted into Jammu and Kashmir, into Srinagar, and managed to stall the advance. And in due course, with the induction of additional forces, they dealt with the raiders, pushed them back in most parts of the state. And the first Indo-Pakistan War took place at that time in 1947-48. And operations, of course, were successfully prosecuted by the Indian Army in the Kashmir Valley, Poonch, Rajouri, Nowshera, Kargil, and all the sectors, in fact. Now, ironically, connected with what, as the Indian Army was poised for the final thrust towards Muzaffarabad, Domel, and even through Skardu towards the Gilgit-Baltistan and all that, India's political leadership decided to take the issue to the United Nations. Now, in hindsight, of course, we can say that it was a retrograde decision, at least in military terms. But the path was probably chosen at that time because India was a founding member of the United Nations, and there probably was a perception that we would get a fair deal from the international community. What followed was a ceasefire agreement that was drawn up on the 27th of July 1949 at Karachi under the auspices of the United Nations by the military representatives of both sides. The Indian military representatives were Lieutenant General Sri Nagesh, Major General K.S. Thimaya, and Brigadier S.F. H.J. Manekshaw. So they were the signatories. And of course, on the Pakistani side, they were their own representatives. Now that agreement, in fact, it spelled out in great detail point-to-point references mentioning the delineation between the two sides as on 1st January 1949, the line separating the two forces. And it was, to that agreement was appended a quarter-inch map duly marked with these points. Now, I mentioned this quarter-inch map because I think it is important. That is what was the ceasefire line at that time, the CFL, as people of my generation referred to it for a long, long time, the forerunner of today's line of control, the LOC, as it were. Now, there are a couple of important aspects that merit mention in this context are the scale of the map. If I mentioned to you, I mentioned that it's a quarter-inch map. That may make sense to a military man. But the fact of the matter is, a quarter-inch map means 1 inch on the map represents 4 miles. So if you draw a line on a map like that, you can imagine that the thickness of the line itself would indicate quite a couple of 100 yards, if not more, on the ground. And that, of course, was a recipe for many of the disagreements that took place there. The line went through gorges, nalas, and it led to different interpretations on the ground and became subjects of disputes over the years and problems, which continue even to this day, ironically. The ceasefire line was delineated up to a point that is marked there as NJ 9842, which is just south of the glaciers, because beyond that was inhospitable terrain, uninhabited, and it was not possible to carry out any delineation at that time. And the agreement then therefore stated up to NJ 9842 specific points were delineated, and from there it said, thence northwards to the glaciers. Now, during the 1971 war, notwithstanding the outstanding successes achieved by the Indian Armed Forces in the Eastern Theatre and in the Shakargarh, Punjab and Rajasthan sectors, there were only, I think, marginal gains along the then CFL, minor changes here and there, except I think the major ones would really be the Pakistani annexation of a portion of territory in the Cham sector again in 1971. And for us, a very vital gain was the capture of Turtuk in the Ladakh region, which I think was a very major achievement at that time. Now, getting on to the Shimla Agreement and the line of control, the emergence of the line of control as it is called today. The Shimla Agreement, as you are all aware, entered into by Mrs. Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on the 3rd of July 1972. And so far, for this discussion, I think, entailed the following. In the Shakargarh, Punjab and Rajasthan sectors, the forces of the two sides would be withdrawn behind the international borders as recognized. In Jammu and Kashmir, a revised delineation of the line separating the two forces was drawn up to reflect the position as it stood on the 17th of December 1971. And ironically, that delineation also extended only up to NJ 9842, and the wording remained thence northwards to the glaciers. So that is the LOC of today. The J&K dispute, of course, was to be resolved bilaterally, no UN involvement, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, the approximately 93,000 Pakistani prisoners who had been captured in the Eastern Theatre were to be repatriated. Now, I'll just read to you the exact wording of the agreement insofar of Jammu and Kashmir is concerned. It's of interest, I think. It states, and I quote, "In Jammu and Kashmir, the line of control resulting from the ceasefire of 17 December 1971 shall be respected by both sides without prejudice to the recognized position of each side. Neither side shall seek to alter it unilaterally, irrespective of mutual differences and legal interpretation. Both sides further undertake to refrain from the threat or the use of force in violation of this line." Now, finally, I'd just like to mention a couple of words about the glaciers. Now, this area north of NJ 9842. And this here, I think what one has to understand is the Pakistani interpretation is ostensibly is that the ceasefire line extends from NJ 9842 directly northeast to the Karakoram Pass. And whereas our interpretation, as recorded in the ceasefire agreement, is northwards along the Saltoro Ridge, which runs west of the Siachen Glacier, extending to what we call Indira Kol at the snout of the glacier. Now, what has happened here is merits brief mention. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, I think due to ease of access from the Skardu side in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, the Pakistanis were sponsoring mountaineering expeditions into areas across the Saltoro Ridge line, including foreign ones. And this, when it came to our notice, I think the Indian Army, in response, mounted expeditions of its own. The most notable one being that led by Colonel Narendra Kumar, Bull Kumar as he was called in the Indian Army, of Everest fame actually, in 1978, where he led an expedition along the Siachen Glacier right up to Indira Kol. And in April 1984, acting on intelligence reports of Pakistan Army's acquisition of high-altitude equipment and preparation for action in the glaciers, the Indian Army preempted the Pakistanis by occupying selected heights along the Saltoro Ridge line, including Siala, Bilafondla, and in due course, Gyongla. Now this, I think, is something which is greatly commended by in terms of what the Indian Army, the commanders on the spot did at that time, because our troops have been in occupation of those heights ever since, despite repeated and determined attempts by the Pakistanis over the years to dislodge them.
I'm speaking on Siachen Glacier. The name suggests that Siachen, as people often ask, what is Siachen? Siachen is nothing but a name of a rose, which is found only in that area in the Nubra Valley, beyond which the Siachen Glacier opens it into a vista which very few people have experienced. Siachen Glacier often reminds people of an area which is called by the soldiers as the highest battlefield on the earth. Siachen Glacier is also understood by people as a place of conflict between India and Pakistan. Siachen Glacier is also known as a place in the world where survival of a human being is put to such a test that whether you are fighting the real enemy or not, you are inadvertently fighting the weather. So the stresses on the body, stress on the mind, and stress on the psyche of a human being is of such a high order that those who have been to Siachen Glacier are the only ones who can tell the story of the Siachen Glacier. I shall now just describe what Siachen Glacier looks like, since I've spoken about the Nubra and the Shyok. Siachen Glacier is like a frozen river. It is not only frozen with water, it is frozen with hardened blue ice, which moves at a very slow pace, and every time the seasonal snowfall comes on it, and that slow space of movement of the ice becomes thickened, and then it continues to move southwards. So it is a flowing river of ice, and when it moves in that kind of a small pace, it goes over an area and it opens out and it cracks and makes it to a big cracks which are called crevasses. And that is what makes the entire area look like a highway, but when you walk onto it, you don't know that it is not so much of a highway. It is not a smooth walk. And when you walk northwards, the area from where the Siachen Glacier starts, or to explain it differently, where it ends, because it starts from the north and the flow is from north to the south. The area where the Siachen Glacier ends is called snout, and then the water that gets formed at the snout goes into the Nubra Valley, and this is Nubra River. And Nubra Valley and the Nubra River is actually known as the Valley of Flowers because it derives its name from the flower called the Siachen, and this is the Siachen. And then if you were to move northwards, on the left-hand side, if you're moving, that is on the western side, is a ridge line called the Santoro Ridge. And on the right-hand side, or the eastern side, is a ridge line called the Karakoram Range. In the late 70s, it was known that now the Pakistanis have started permitting the Mountaineer expeditions from the Japanese team, and they were allowed to move into this area. But this was not known to us till as late as 1978, when Colonel Kumar, who was the commandant of Hawes, came to know from the German expedition that they wanted to do an expedition in the Nubra Valley. They wanted to come down along the Nubra, and then they wanted to do rafting into the Shyok River.
I am Colonel Kumar, basically a mountaineer, but I have led 3 military missions for India. First one was in Bharavati in 1961, which was against China. The second one was Siachen mission in 1978, which was against Pakistan. And again, the third one, Siachen mission in 1981. In 1975, 2 Germans had come and they wanted to raft down Indus River. Well, Sheikh Abdullah, these and the chief ministers sent for me, and I said, well, if they are going there, I must be with them. So looking at my age, they made me the leader, and we did this Indus boat expedition. It was not a big adventure, but it got a tremendous publicity because Mrs. Gandhi had announced emergency, and there's, other papers couldn't publish anything, so they kept on publishing. So much so that Mrs. Gandhi asked me to brief her on this Indus expedition. Well, 2 years later, they brought back a map and said, look, we want you to come down Nubra River. Now, they brought a map where where the ceasefire line goes up to NJ 9842. From there, actually, in the treaty, it was that it goes northwards was glacier, not marked. But the American map had shown NJ 9842 to Karakoram Pass, giving about 10,000 square kilometers to Pakistan. I took this map to the DGMO, General Shimla, and firstly he said, look, you go to my deputy DMO, and that was Satya. There we went through all the treaties, Sikh-British War, 47 Indus Agreement, 48 J&K ceasefire line, and Shimla Agreement. We did not find any mention of this line. So we went back, and he said, what can you do? I said, sir, I'll take an expedition. So I took the advanced course of High Altitude Warfare School for 78 expedition. But I was warned that I will not go even an inch westwards from this line NJ 9842 to north. We had drawn a line towards north, and I kept to the east of it, and the only peak which came in that area was Taram Kangri, which we went and climbed. Actually, the Indira Call is the distance ground, and the glacier coming from the left is called Bilafonla Glacier. This post was named after me, but I showed you that I did not name it. It was named after 84 when the war started. Well, before going to Taram Kangri, we had to cross a lot of glaciers, and from Taram Kangri shoulder, this shows you Bilafonla, from where the Pakistanis used to send expeditions. And actually, I brought in proof. This was the proof which I showed it to the army headquarters, that these are things left by expedition which was coming there. So once I got there, I told them, look, going halfway is no good. We must go right to the Indira Call along the Saltoro Ring. Next 2 years, we had a Janta government, no decision was taken. I put in my resignation. I was about to go on a 6-month leave pending retirement, and when it was cleared that we could go to Shimla. Well, I took the advanced course to Siachen Glacier. It was all done during my leave pending retirement, and as I had lost my toes in frostbite, it had to be done on my own risk. Well, that is tabletop of stone. The stem is saved by the shadow of the stone, and otherwise the ice melts around. That's why we call it tabletop. Well, there are many streams there. There are streams which are above the surface, the streams inside the glacier. This is the tunnel we found inside the Siachen Glacier. Once upon a time, a huge river used to flow through that. It must have been blocked and found some other way. Well, these tunnels helped us going from one trough to another trough. Otherwise, we had to climb our forts to climb the ice falls and to get to other side. And that's how sometimes we were on our forts, and we went right up to Bilafonla. The upper portion, these are the crevasses, sometimes 200 feet deep. And we have to be very careful while negotiating these crevasses. The upper portion of Siachen Glacier is all covered by snow, and we carried our loads in a sledge and working as husky dogs. Well, we reached, this is Indira Call, the watershed between the Indian Ocean and the river which goes into Tibet. This is Untitled Glacier there, and it was said earlier that 100 years back, Mrs. Bookworm had gone to Indira Call, but later on the research said that they had been 2.5 kilometers short of it. It was only Colonel Narendra Kumar's team which went there first. Well, after Indira Call, we went to Siachen. It was been led by my deputy leader, Mrs. Chopra. I gave them the flag and went up to Camp 3 to receive them. When they came back, after debriefing, I found that they had not climbed the mountain. So next day, I went to the top and we climbed Siachen. Siachen is important. It's a tri-junction of China-occupied Kashmir, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and India. Well, coming back, actually I was only a day's journey from K2, and I asked Army headquarters if I could go and touch the base camp. I am sure you, if we had gone to the base camp of K2, the fight would have been not for Siachen, but for K2. But unfortunately, the government did not allow me to go to K2, and we came back.